I don't hate JavaScript. I know a lot of people think that just because I make a lot of fun of JavaScript or my phrase is from JavaScript to Laravel, JS to Laravel, that kind of thing, it doesn't mean I don't think JavaScript is useful or even essential in the modern web. I just think that the ecosystem of JavaScript has been in this phase for far too long that is the answer to everything, instead of using JavaScript where it needs to be the answer. So before I go off on that rant, we're going to read Hypermedia on Whatever You'd Like by Carson Gross, the creator of HTMX, written on May 23rd, 2023. And I think there's going to be a lot that I like and maybe things that I don't necessarily agree on in this article, but it'd be interesting to read it all the way through and then share my thoughts as well. But Carson Gross is the creator of HTMX. You can find Carson on Big Sky Software at GitHub, or the website bigsky.software is Carson Gross's CV. Hypermedia on Whatever You'd Like. The one big remaining advantage of MPAs is server-side programming, language choice. If you're already part of the anti-JavaScript resistance, then nothing I say in the rest of this talk is going to matter that much, but I'm going to get into this later. That ship might have sailed. That was a quote from Rich Harris, Have SPAs Ruined the Web? A concept we'd like to talk about is the HOWL stack. HOWL stands for Hypermedia on Whatever You'd Like. This is a joke, but not really, software stack, and a reference to more well-known stacks like the LAMP stack or the MEAN stack. The TLDR of the HOWL stack is this: when you use a hypermedia-driven approach for your web application, you free yourself up to choose whatever server-side technology best fits your problem and your own technical tastes. Feeling the JavaScript pressure. If you decide to use an SPA framework for your web application, you will naturally have a large front-end code base that is written in JavaScript. Given that, the following question inevitably will come up: well, why aren't we doing the backend in JavaScript too? This is a reasonable question to ask, and there are a lot of advantages to adopting the same programming language on both sides of the wire. You can share application logic between the two code bases. A good example here is validation logic. You can share data structures between the two code bases. You can build up expertise in a single language, JavaScript, making it easier for developers to work in various parts of your application. You can reuse the build system and dependency management knowledge you've acquired for the front end. This pressure to adopt JavaScript will only grow as your investment in the JavaScript front-end ecosystem grows. Furthermore, JavaScript has improved dramatically in the last 5 years, and there are now multiple excellent server-side runtimes for executing it. Many of the older arguments about the messiness of the language can be waved off as preventable via linting, developer discipline, and so forth. JavaScript is the dominant language among the web development thought leaders, and there are massive numbers of tutorials, code camps, etc. that strongly emphasize the language. Nothing succeeds like success, and JavaScript, as well as React, have succeeded. Let's call the result of this the JavaScript pressure and acknowledge that nearly every developer working with the web feels it, at least to some extent. Hypermedia, our only hope. What hope do non-JavaScript developers have in web development? Well, there is one older technology sitting there in the browser alongside JavaScript: Hypermedia. Browsers offer excellent HTML support and the related document object model, or DOM. In fact, even if you are using an SPA framework, you will be working with that Hypermedia infrastructure in some form, via JSX templates, for example, if only to create UIs that a browser can understand. So you are going to be using HTML or the related DOM APIs in some manner in your web application. Well, what if we made HTML a more powerful hypermedia? That's the idea of HTMX, which makes it possible to implement common modern web application patterns using the hypermedia approach. This closes the UX gap between traditional MPAs and SPAs, taking the hypermedia route feasible for a much larger set of web applications. Once you adopt this hypermedia approach, and remember, you're going to be using hypermedia infrastructure anyway, so why not leverage it as much as possible? A surprising side effect occurs. Suddenly, the advantage of server-side language choice that Harris attributed to MPAs is back on the table. If your application's front end is mainly written in terms of HTML, maybe with a bit of client-side scripting and with no large JavaScript code base, you suddenly dramatically diminished or entirely eliminated the JavaScript pressure on the back end. You can now make your server-side language and framework choice based on other considerations, technical, aesthetic, or otherwise. Perhaps you are working in AI and want to use a Lisp variant for your project. Perhaps you're working in big data and want to use Python. Perhaps you know Django really well and love the batteries included approach it takes. Perhaps you prefer Flask and the stripped-down approach it takes. Perhaps you like the raw, close to the HTML feel of PHP. Perhaps you have an existing Java code base that needs some sprucing up. Perhaps you are learning COBOL and want to use HTMX to make a nice front end for it. Perhaps you just really like Rust, OCaml, Kotlin, Haskell, .NET, Clojure, Ada, Cold Fusion, Ruby, whatever. These are all perfectly reasonable technical, philosophical, and aesthetic perspectives. And by adopting Hypermedia as your primary front-end technology, you pursue any of these goals without a bicameral code base. Hypermedia doesn't care what you use to produce it. You can use Hypermedia on whatever you'd like. An open web for everyone. And when we say whatever, we really mean it. Here is a screenshot of the HTMX Discord's HOWL subsection recently. Know that these are just the channels that happen to have active traffic. There are many more. You can see we have ongoing conversations in a bunch of different programming languages and frameworks: Java, Go, .NET, Rust, Clojure, PHP, Ruby, Python, OCaml. We even have some folks talking about using HTMX with Bash and COBOL. This is exactly the future that we want to see, a rich and vibrant web in which every backend language and framework can play as an equal and interesting alternative. Each language and framework has their own unique strengths and cultures, and each can contribute to the magical hypermedia system that is the web. But is it an anti-JavaScript resistance? Before we finish this essay, we do want to address the idea that the resistance to JavaScript everywhere is necessarily anti-JavaScript. Now, admittedly, we have laughed at our fair share of jokes about JavaScript, and we have gone so far as to create an alternative scripting language for the web, HyperScript. So it might seem like we should be card-carrying anti-JavaScriptites. But to the contrary, we are deeply appreciative of JavaScript. After all, both HTMX and HyperScript are built in JavaScript. We couldn't have created these libraries without JavaScript, which, whatever else one might say, has the great virtue of being there. And we even go so far as to recommend using JavaScript for front-end scripting needs in a hypermedia-driven application, so long as you script in a hypermedia-friendly way. Further, we wouldn't steer someone away from using JavaScript or TypeScript on the server side for a hypermedia-driven application if that language is the best option for your team. As we said earlier, JavaScript now has multiple excellent server-side runtimes and many excellent server-side libraries available. It might be the best option for you and your team, and there's no reason not to use it in that case. Hypermedia on whatever you'd like means just that, whatever you'd like. But JavaScript is not, and it should not be, the only server-side option for your team. Turning the ship around. With the resurgence of interest in and improvements of hypermedia, an open and diverse future for the web is now a real possibility, if not an emergent reality. The web was designed to be an open, polyglot, and participative hypermedia system, and the ship hasn't sailed on that dream, at least not yet. We can keep that dream alive by relearning and re-embracing the foundational technology of the web, hypermedia. Quote from Teach: "I hate that the HTMX community has devolved into builders helping each other without regard for likes, engaging those who don't follow the hype, expanding sound bites into nuance. It may not score cheap social media points, but it's healthy. The web used to be worse than this." I talked in my AlpineAJAX video, or both of the videos that I made about AlpineAJAX, and I talked about how I don't really know HTMX that well. I know enough about HTMX to know what it does. I know that AlpineAJAX was inspired by HTMX and is just a little bit more formatted for Alpine itself. And I know that Livewire was heavily inspired by HTMX, and similar to things like Hotwire and all these things that have tight integrations with their particular backend of choice. So something like Livewire isn't backend agnostic in the same way that HTMX is, or even AlpineAJAX is. And there's a reason why. A lot of people ask me, why did you go from JavaScript, knowing JavaScript, and not using inertia with Laravel? There's a couple of different reasons why, and I talk about them in my tech stack video that I'll link in the description or show notes, as well as like a little card up here if you're watching the video. But the premise of it is how it resonated with me as a developer in the sense of DX. How was I writing particular code? how I would write particular code within the JavaScript ecosystem, mostly using things like Next.js or Svelte and SvelteKit, I was using something like Firebase or Supabase or stuff like that, where I would interact with the server in my client code. Or maybe sometimes I was writing server-side functions within an API route. And a lot of times I was doing a lot of co-location. I was writing my code and then writing the logic for my code just a couple lines up. That's why I liked Svelte, because I could write JavaScript in my script tag up above, and then in my template I could just write HTML. And what appealed to me most about Livewire, it was the same thing, especially when Livewire Volt came out. It was just more tightly knit with the back end, where I could call server-side code from my server logic, and then in my template, I can just write HTML. And there's a reason why I think HTMX is so talked about and popular right now, is because it forces you to think about where are you using JavaScript. Again, I am not anti-JavaScript. I don't hate JavaScript. Livewire uses a ton of JavaScript and just obfuscates it away from me and forces me to choose when I'm using Alpine, for example, versus when I'm using Livewire. When am I, and I have a lot of videos about this, but when am I opening a dialog? Should that dialog be opened on the server and I get information from the dialog from the server, or does it already exist on the client and I'm just opening it up? Now I have to consciously think about these choices. And I think that's where this resistance, not even resistance, I think that's where this effort comes from within the HTMX world, the HTMX ecosystem, is there are things that the web has given us for free within HTML, within Hypermedia, within JavaScript. But are we using them in the way that they are meant to be used? Are we trying to kind of push them into a hole that maybe they shouldn't be pushed into? I'm a huge fan of using the tools that you need for the projects that you need, just as much as I'm a huge fan of learning new things for the sake of learning, and also learning how to do things in a tool that you use that might not even be the best tool for the particular problem at hand, but then you know why it's not the best tool. Instead of just automatically saying, well, I can't use HTMX because I have to do this and it's this whole SPA thing that I'm going to need. Well, maybe if you're wanting to learn HTMX, maybe start building that. Say, okay, well, why does everyone say this isn't good in an SPA format? I have done the same thing with Livewire, and I've become a better Livewire developer. Now, I'm not going to say Livewire is the perfect solution for every single scenario. I think it can be used that way, but there's a reason why other tools exist. There's a reason why Inertia exists. There's a reason why React, Next.js, there's a reason why all these things exist. And you have to learn how to do that instead of taking someone else's word for why it exists or why it doesn't work in a particular scenario. So again, if you're wanting to learn HTMX, or maybe insert your own meta framework here within JavaScript or Laravel first, instead of saying, I can't learn that because my new project, it doesn't work with that. I really need this fully featured, fast client-side framework. I need this insert particular feature from Next.js or Vercel or something like that. Well, first, in whatever thing you want to learn, again, it all goes back to that, learn why people say that. Why do people say HTMX can't be an SPA? I don't think that's fully the case. I think there's ways you can make it, but learn, okay, well, it's because you have to talk to the server every single time you need to do something. So you really need something like Alpine or something like Vue Petite, for example, on the front end, doing a lot of those interactions. But you can still make it very SPA-like, whether you're using HTMX, Livewire, Hotwire, Turbolinks, what have you. Learn the reason why you're not doing something, or learn the reason why you're not using something before you learn the reason why you should do it. And all of that comes with just building things, just learning about things, or just using things in a way that maybe it should be used and maybe it shouldn't. Because that's when you'll truly know, okay, am I using this the way I should? Or am I just getting better at the tools that I have at my disposal?